Some of the most consequential decisions you'll ever make as a leader may happen before you realize that you've actually made them. Before the meeting, before the conversation, before the data, before anyone else has even entered the room. You tell yourself you're still evaluating, still listening, still considering the possibilities, but somewhere underneath all of that, you may have already decided. And now you're no longer looking for the answer, you're looking for evidence that confirms the answer you already have. That's a very different form of leadership. I've spent more than 25 years sitting across from the CEOs, founders, board members, investors, and executive leaders making incredible consequential decisions: who to hire, who to fire, where to invest, where to acquire, when to walk away, when to trust, and when to change direction. And I've noticed something: the most dangerous decisions aren't always the bad ones. They're the ones we never realized we'd already made. Because once a decision becomes attached to our identity, our experience, our reputation, or our need to be right, something changes. We stop exploring and start defending. We stop asking, what am I missing? And start asking, how do I prove this? We call it conviction. We call it instinct. We call it experience. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's something else entirely. And here's the question I've become extremely fascinated with. How do you know the difference? How do you know when you're trusting 25 years of experience and when you're simply protecting 25 years of identity? How do you know when your intuition is speaking and when your nervous system is reacting? How do you know when you're making the decision and when the decision has already been made? Because high performance leadership isn't simply about making better decisions. Sometimes it's having enough awareness to recognize what inside you is actually making them. And that is where today's conversation begins. Before you ever walk into an important meeting, you bring something with you. Not your presentation, not the financials, not the board materials. You bring your story. You bring a story about what you believe is happening, who's performing and who isn't, which strategy will work, whether this acquisition makes sense, who's responsible for the problem, and sometimes what you already believe the answer should be. And that's where this gets extremely interesting. The more experienced we become as leaders, the better we become at recognizing patterns. We've seen this before. We've hired this type of executive before. We've entered this market before. We've watched this kind of strategy fail before. We've dealt with this personality before. Experience gives us something incredibly valuable: speed. We don't have to analyze every situation from zero. We recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, and we connect the dots. That's executive judgment. And at the highest levels of leadership, judgment matters enormously. But there is a shadow side to experience that we don't talk about nearly enough. Sometimes experience doesn't help us see what's happening. Sometimes experience tells us what we're supposed to see. And those are very different things. Imagine you're interviewing a candidate for a mission critical executive leadership position. You reviewed the resume, you've heard the references, you've studied the background, and within the first several minutes of the conversation, something happens. You like them. There's chemistry. They remind you of someone. Maybe even someone you've worked incredibly well in that position before. And almost immediately, your brain begins assembling the case. Strong presence, great communicator, understands our industry, cultural fit. They get it. You haven't consciously decided anything yet. At least that's what you believe. But now watch what happens. Instead of testing your hypothesis, you begin validating it. You interpret ambiguity generously. You explain away inconsistencies, and you spend more time exploring strengths than exposing weaknesses. And by the end of that conversation, you say something I've heard countless times over the years. I just have a really good feeling about this person. And guess what? Maybe you're right. But maybe you walked into the conversation looking for evidence to support a decision your mind had already begun making. That just doesn't happen in hiring. It happens everywhere. Leadership matters. You walked into board meeting believing the strategy is right, and you listen differently. You walk into a performance conversation believing the executive isn't capable, and you listen differently. You walk into an acquisition discussion believing the company is extraordinary, and you examine the risk differently. You walk into a negotiation believing the other side is extremely unreasonable, and you interpret their behavior differently. You walk into a difficult conversation believing you're right, and you hear everything differently. And that's the part that fascinates me. The decision doesn't only influence what we think, it can influence what we're capable of seeing. That's why this is such an important high performance leadership conversation. Intelligence doesn't necessarily protect us from this, experience doesn't necessarily protect us from this, success doesn't necessarily protect us from this. Sometimes they make us better at it. And highly intelligent, experienced leaders can construct incredibly sophisticated explanations for why their instinct is correct. And we can defend our conclusions with data, experience, logic, pattern recognition, and 25 years of evidence without ever realizing we're using all of that intelligence to defend something we've decided emotionally 5 minutes earlier. I've come to believe one of the most important disciplines in executive leadership is the ability to separate what I know from what I believe now. The space between those two things is enormous. And extraordinary leaders learn to live inside the space longer than everyone else. They remain curious. They challenge their own assumptions. They actively look for information that could prove them wrong. Not because they're indecisive, because they're disciplined. And there is a tremendous difference between hesitation and curiosity. Hesitation is being afraid to decide. Curiosity is being strong enough to delay certainty. Hesitation is being afraid to decide. Curiosity is being strong enough to delay certainty. And perhaps that's one of the defining characteristics of high performance leadership. It's not how quickly you arrive at the answer, it's how long you're willing to remain genuinely open to the possibility that your first answer might be wrong. So here's a question I'd like you to carry into your next consequential decision. Before anyone speaks, before the presentation begins, and before you examine the data, ask yourself, what have I already decided? Then ask the harder question. What would I need to see today to change my mind? And if you can't answer that question, you may not have walked into the room to make a decision. You're probably walking into that room to defend one. And there is something dangerous that happens when you've been right a lot. You start expecting to be right again, not arrogantly, but consciously, and usually not maliciously. You simply have evidence. You've built companies, you've hired people, you've navigated recessions, you've raised capital, you've survived crisis, you've made decisions when everyone else was waiting for more information. And many of those decisions worked. Eventually, experience earns you something incredibly valuable: conviction. But conviction has a shadow. Enough evidence that you're being right in the past can make it extraordinarily difficult to recognize when you're wrong in the present. I'm going to repeat that. Ruminate on this one. Write it down. Conviction has a shadow. And that shadow is enough evidence that you've been right in the past can make it extraordinarily difficult to recognize when you're wrong in the present. And this is where high performance leadership gets uncomfortable, because the executive most vulnerable too isn't necessarily inexperienced. It may be the most accomplished person in the room. The CEO everyone trusts, the founder who built the company from nothing, the board member who's seen 20 versions of this movie, the investor who's made this bet before, the leader whose instincts have been rewarded for decades. That's precisely why nobody wants to challenge them. And eventually, something subtle happens. The track record enters the room before the evidence does. Think about that. When someone with enormous credibility says, I've seen this before, what happens to the conversation? People listen differently. Questions disappear. Confidence moves through the room. The junior executive who sees something different starts wondering whether they're missing something. And the senior executive who disagrees begins calculating whether this is the hill worth dying on. And suddenly, an observation from one powerful person becomes the gravitational center of the entire conversation. And nobody made that happen intentionally. That's simply what authority does. But here's where it becomes dangerous. The more credibility you accumulate as a leader, the more responsibility you have to question your own certainty, because everyone else may stop doing it for you. I've watched executives become incredibly frustrated with their teams for not challenging them. They'll say, I need people around me who will push back. And I sometimes wonder whether they've asked themselves the more uncomfortable question: what happens when somebody actually does push back? Do you become curious, or do you immediately explain why they're wrong? Do you ask another question, or do you begin presenting your resume? Do you explore their perspective, or do you subtly remind everyone how many times you've seen this before? Because saying challenging me is easy. Being challenged when the stakes are high, your reputation is attached, and you believe you're right, is something entirely different. Here's an even harder question. When was the last time someone with significantly less experience than you changed your mind about something important? Not added to your thinking, not gave you an interesting perspective, changed your mind. And if you can't remember, there are two possibilities to consider. Maybe you're consistently the smartest person in every room you enter. Or Maybe your experience has quietly become a filter that prevents new information from getting through. And I know which possibility I'd investigate first. There's another phrase experienced executive use that deserves examination. Trust your gut. And I believe deeply in intuition. But I also think we've romanticized it because your gut isn't some magical executive oracle. Your instincts contain experience and pattern recognition, but they also contain fear, ego, old wounds, conditioning, past successes, past failures, your need for control, your need to always be right, your need not to look foolish in front of the board. And sometimes all of that speaks with exactly the same confidence as wisdom. That's why one of the most dangerous sentences in executive leadership may be, I just know. Maybe you do. But high performance leadership requires enough self awareness to ask, what exactly is doing the knowing? Is this wisdom? Is this pattern recognition? Is this fear? Is this ego? Is this yesterday's experience being projected on today's problem? Or am I protecting a decision because changing my mind now would require me to admit that I walked into this room wrong? And that's uncomfortable. Good. Because the consequential leadership should occasionally make us uncomfortable. And here's where it gets even more personal. Sometimes we don't defend decisions because they're right. We defend them because they're ours. We recommend the acquisition. We hired the executive. We championed the strategy. We made the promise to the board. We stood in front of everyone and said, this is the direction. Follow me. Now new information appears, and suddenly changing direction doesn't feel like judgment. It feels like defeat. So we move the goalposts. We explain away the evidence. We give the executive another quarter. We put capital into the strategy. We tell ourselves the market hasn't caught up yet. We call persistence leadership. But sometimes persistence is just ego with a longer timeline, my friends. And that's the sentence I want you to sit with. Sometimes persistence is just your ego with a longer timeline. High performers are especially vulnerable to this because quitting has been trained out of us. Push harder, stay committed, finish what you started, never give up. Those beliefs can build extraordinary careers. They can also keep intelligent leaders committed to decisions that reality has been asking them to reconsider for months. And the highest form of executive judgment isn't always knowing when to stay committed. Sometimes it's recognizing when the evidence has changed and having the courage to change with it, even when your name is attached to the original decision, especially then, actually. Because your job as a leader isn't to prove that yesterday's version of you was right. Your job is to make the best decisions available to today's version of you. And those are profoundly different responsibilities. And if protecting your reputation becomes more important than updating your thinking, you're no longer leading the decision. Your identity is. Which brings us somewhere even more uncomfortable. Because sometimes the decision isn't made by your experience, sometimes it's made by your intellect. Sometimes your body made it first. And here's where this conversation gets controversial. We'd like to believe that the consequential executive decisions are made by rational, experienced, disciplined leaders carefully evaluating the facts. And I'm not convinced that's always true. Sometimes the spreadsheet arrives after the decision. Sometimes the analysis arrives after the decision. Sometimes the strategy arrives after the decision. Sometimes the intellect is simply hired to defend what something much deeper inside us has already decided. And your body is constantly interpreting the environment around you: threat, safety, status, rejection, uncertainty, control. And it can respond before you consciously constructed a single thought about what's happening. Then something fascinating occurs. Your intellect finally catches up. And because you're intelligent, you're experienced, you're articulate, you can build an extraordinarily convincing explanation for a reaction that may have started somewhere entirely different. We call it judgment, we call it instinct, we call it leadership, but sometimes it's simply a reaction wearing a very expensive suit. Think about the last time someone challenged you publicly, not privately, in front of your executive team or your board. You were presenting something you believed in, and someone across the table said, "I don't think that's right." What happened inside you in the first 2 seconds? Not what did you say, what happened inside you? Go inward. Did something tighten? Did your heart rate change? Did you immediately begin constructing your rebuttal? Did you stop listening while they were talking? Did you feel an almost irresistible need to correct the record? That's the moment I'm interested in hearing more about, because the most consequential part of that conversation may have happened before you ever opened your mouth. Now imagine that person isn't challenging your idea. They're challenging your executive hire, your acquisition thesis, your forecast, your leadership, your integrity, your competence, your identity. And the closer the challenge gets to who you believe yourself to be, the more difficult it becomes to separate the information from the perceived threat. And that's where extremely accomplished leaders can become surprisingly irrational. We've all seen it. Not because they're weak, because they're human. And title doesn't remove that. The corner office doesn't remove that. At Harvard, MBA doesn't remove that. 25 years of experience doesn't remove that. A $1 billion balance sheet doesn't remove that. Sometimes success simply gives our unconscious reactions more authority. And here's the part that may irritate some of the people listening. I don't believe emotional regulation is a soft leadership skill. I believe it's one that the most unprecedented forms of executive intelligence, because the executive who cannot regulate themselves under pressure eventually forces the room to regulate around them. Write it down. I'm going to repeat it. The executive who cannot regulate themselves under pressure eventually forces the room to regulate around them. And when the leader cannot regulate themselves, the organization begins regulating around the leader. People soften the message. They delay the bad news. They carefully choose when to approach you. They rehearse how they're going to say something to you. They bring allies into the conversation. They leave uncomfortable facts out of the presentation. They learn which version of you they're going to get based on that day, the pressure, the numbers, or what happened in the meeting immediately before theirs. And eventually, an entire organization can become extraordinarily skilled at managing one person's central nervous system. We might call that culture. I don't. I call it organizational adaptation. And it can become incredibly expensive because new information isn't traveling through the organization based on importance. It's traveling based on emotional safety. Think about the implications of that. The CEO believes they're receiving unfiltered information. The executive team believes they're protecting the CEO from unnecessary noise. The board believes management is aligned. Everyone looks professional, everyone looks composed. And underneath all of it, people are editing reality before it reaches the person making the decision. And that's how leadership blind spots become enterprise risk. This is why presence matters so much. Presence isn't sitting quietly in meditation before your first meeting. Presence is recognizing the moment your internal reaction is attempting to become an external decision. It's noticing the anger before you call it conviction. It's noticing the fear before you call it prudence. It's noticing the ego before you call it a standard. And it's noticing the need for control before you call it accountability. It's noticing the need to win before you call it a strategy. That's predictable, conscious leadership. Not becoming emotionless, becoming aware enough that emotion doesn't get to impersonate wisdom. And there's another side to this that very few executives want to discuss. Some decisions feel good because they reinforce who we already believe we are. The aggressive acquisition feels right because we're the bold CEO. Walking away feels right because we're the disciplined investor. Firing someone feels right because we're the leader who demands excellence. Keeping someone feels right because we're loyal. Taking the risk feels right because we're entrepreneurial. Avoiding the risk feels right because we're responsible. Notice what just happened. We can create a leadership identity that justifies almost any decision we want to make. That's why self-awareness isn't enough. You need self-confrontation. Self-awareness says, I know I tend to be controlling. Self-confrontation asks, how is my need for control influencing these decisions right now? Self-awareness says, I move quickly. Self-confrontation asks, am I moving quickly because speed is required or because uncertainty makes me uncomfortable? Self-awareness says, I trust my instincts. Self-confrontation asks, what evidence would make me distrust this instinct? And that's a different level of leadership. And frankly, I think that's where many highly accomplished executives stop. They become aware enough to describe themselves, but not conscious enough to interrupt themselves. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about an important decision, don't immediately trust the certainty. Investigate it and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Then ask, what am I protecting right now? And finally ask the question that may be the hardest of all. If my identity weren't attached to this outcome, would I still make the same decision? Because sometimes the most important leadership decision isn't deciding what to do, it's creating enough space between what you feel and what you do so that you actually get to make the decision. Not your fear, not your ego, not your history, not your need to be right. You. And that tiny, 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 tiny space between reaction and response may be one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in high performance leadership. There's a phrase we rarely celebrate in executive leadership. It's one of my favorites. I don't know yet. Think about how uncomfortable those words can feel when you're the CEO. People aren't paying you to know now. The board isn't looking at you because they want uncertainty. Investors don't reward hesitation. Your executive team expects direction. You're supposed to know. So we learn to know quickly. We form opinions, we take positions, we create certainty, we make the call, and we're damn good at it. And eventually, certainty becomes part of the performance of leadership. But I've started wondering whether some of the most consequential leadership mistakes begin with a leader becoming certain too quickly. Because certainty feels powerful, curiosity doesn't. Certainty closes the loop, curiosity keeps it open. Certainty tells the room, I've got this. Curiosity has the courage to say, there may be something here I don't see yet. And at the highest levels of predictable leadership, I believe that distinction becomes incredibly important. The strongest leader in the room may not be the person with the fastest answer. It may be the person with enough internal security to remain genuinely curious while everyone else is rushing towards that certainty. And that's not indecision, it's discipline. And there's a difference between being unable. While the other person is still speaking. They can receive information that contradicts their original position without experiencing it as a threat. And perhaps most importantly, they can change their mind without experiencing the change as a loss of authority. The last one matters because somewhere along the way, leadership taught many of us that consistency equals strength. You said it, you own it, you stand behind it. I agree with that when we're talking about values. I'm not sure I agree when we're talking about judgment. If the information changes, your thinking should be allowed to change. If the environment changes, your decision should be allowed to change. If someone brings you a better idea, your position should be allowed to change. And that, my friends, isn't weakness. The inability to update your thinking may actually be your greatest weakness. I've seen leaders defend yesterday's decision long after today's evidence invalidated it. Why? Because changing the decision would mean admitting they were wrong. And somewhere inside their leadership identity, being wrong feels more dangerous than continuing to be wrong. And that's an extraordinarily expensive trade. Companies pay for it, employees pay for it, shareholders pay for it, families pay for it. Sometimes entire careers pay for it, all because 3 words felt too threatening to say. I was wrong. Imagine what happens inside an executive team when the CEO says those words without qualification. Not, I was wrong, but here's why. Not, I was wrong because I didn't have all the information. Not, technically I wasn't wrong. The circumstances changed. Just admitting I was wrong. Something changes in the room because suddenly everyone else has permission to be wrong too. And when people have permission to be wrong, they become more willing to challenge assumptions. They experiment. They surface the risk earlier. They admit mistakes faster. They stop spending energy protecting their reputation and start spending energy protecting the outcome. That's high performance leadership. And I believe one of the most powerful questions an executive leader can ask before a consequential decision is actually incredibly simple. What would have to be true for me to be wrong? That's a dangerous question because now you're not asking the room to validate your thinking. You're inviting the room to dismantle it. You're telling the smartest people around you, don't protect my position, protect the damn decision. Imagine the difference that creates. Before the acquisition, ask what would have to be true for the thesis to be wrong. Before that executive hire, ask what would have to be true for your instincts about this person to be wrong. Before terminating someone, ask what would have to be true for your assessment of them to be wrong. Before entering the market, ask what would have to be true for your assumptions to be wrong. Before the next board approves the strategy, ask what would have to be true for everyone in this room to be wrong. Now you're doing something very different. You're not trying to make yourself right. You're trying to make the decision right. And that may sound like a small distinction. It isn't. One protects identity, the other protects enterprise value. One asks, how do I defend my position? The other asks, what does reality require from me now? And that's where judgment begins to mature. Not when you become more confident in your instincts, but when you become less emotionally dependent on them being correct. And perhaps that's the evolution of executive judgment. Early in our careers, we learn how to make decisions. Then we learn how to make difficult decisions. And eventually, the real work may be learning how to become the kind of person who can make consequential decisions without needing those decisions to validate who we are. And that, my friends, is freedom. Because now you can listen without defending. You can question without weakening. You can change direction without shame. And you can admit uncertainty without losing your authority. And you can say something that can be among the most powerful sentences available to a leader. I came into this room believing one thing, and what I've heard during this meeting has changed my mind. And that isn't a leader losing the room. That's a leader showing the room what intellectual courage actually looks like. So perhaps before your next consequential decision, the question isn't simply, what should we do? Maybe the first question is, who do I need to become in this moment to see this decision clearly? Because the quality of the decision will always be influenced by the quality of the consciousness you brought to it. And sometimes the most important thing you can bring into the room is the willingness to leave your certainty outside the door. As we close today, I want you to think about one decision you're carrying right now, and don't pick the easiest one. Think about the decision that keeps showing up in the quiet moments, the executive you're uncertain about, the acquisition you're considering, the strategy you're defending, the relationships that's changing, the conversation you know you need to have. Whatever it is, bring that decision to mind. Now, forget about the spreadsheet for a moment. Forget about the presentations. Forget what your advisors think. Forget what you told the board. Forget what you've already said publicly. And ask one question. If I could make this decision again today with absolutely nothing to defend, would I make the same decision? Sit with that. Because your immediate reaction to that question may tell you more than another 100 pages of analysis. High performance leadership requires conviction. It requires decisiveness, courage, judgment, experience, but perhaps the highest expression of leadership is knowing when those very strengths are preventing us from seeing clearly. Because sometimes courage means making the decision, and sometimes courage means standing behind the decision. And sometimes the greatest courage of all is being willing to admit that the decision you made yesterday is no longer the decision you would make today. That isn't weakness, that's consciousness. And there's something else I want you to consider. Every consequential decision has two outcomes. There is what happens because of the decision, and there is who you become while making it. And we spend enormous amounts of time evaluating the first: revenue, growth, enterprise value, performance, risk, return. But I wonder whether we spend enough time examining the second. Did the decision make you more curious or more certain? Did it make you more open or more defensive? Did it deepen your judgment or reinforce your ego? Did you become more willing to hear the truth or more committed to proving yourself right? Because sometimes the greatest consequence of leadership decision isn't what happened afterward. It's what the decision reinforced within the leader. And that's why this conversation was really never about decision making. It's about awareness. The awareness to notice when experience becomes certainty, the awareness to notice when intuition becomes reaction, the awareness to notice when conviction becomes an attachment, the awareness to notice when persistence becomes ego, and the awareness to recognize when the person defending the decision is no longer the same person who should be making it. So tomorrow, when you walk into the boardroom, the executive team meeting, the investment committee, or just another difficult conversation, don't leave your experience outside. Bring it. Don't leave your instincts outside. Bring them. Don't abandon conviction. Bring that too. But bring something else with you. The willingness to be wrong. The willingness to hear something you didn't expect. The willingness to discover something you didn't know. The willingness to change your mind. The willingness to walk out of the room with a different decision than the one you carried into it, because perhaps one of the clearest signs of high performance leadership is not that you know the answer, but that your identity is never more important than discovering the truth. So I'll leave you with one final question. And I wouldn't answer this one quickly. What decision are you defending right now that you need to become willing to make again? Because maybe you didn't walk into the room to make the decision. Maybe you decided before you walked in. And perhaps that's the greatest act of leadership, is having the courage to walk back into that room and make it again. Thank you for joining me today. And until next time, lead from your heart, live from your soul, and remember, the greatest leader you will ever become has been within you the entire time.